I'm Ralph Richard Banks. My friends call me Rick. We want this panel to be as informal as we can make it. I'm the founding director of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. I've been on the Stanford faculty in the law school since 1998. So the center basically began in earnest with the killing of George Floyd, because that prompted a recognition at Stanford and throughout the nation, indeed throughout the world even, that the effects of racism cannot be consigned to the past. They're not even limited to policing. And most provocatively, they also even extend beyond race, in fact. Because racism has undermined American institutions for people of all races, and is, in fact, or at least threatens to, weaken our democracy. This recognition is what brings us here today, to think through, with these distinguished panelists and all of you, some of the challenges that we face as a nation and the potential role for an institution like Stanford in helping our society to meet those challenges. So let's get started. In the spirit of getting right to the meat of things, I will dispense with formal introductions that these panelists' expertise, insights, and contributions in fact warrant. Their full bios are available to you. You can peruse them and sit with them as long as you would like. Instead, let me just give the capsule introduction or the identification of each of our panelists. At the far end of the panel, we have George Brown, the new executive director of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, a long-time and very experienced lawyer. We have Maureen Keffer, Stanford Law School grad, who comes to us from the Civil Rights Unit of the California Department of Social Services. We have the Honorable Goodwin Liu, Associate Justice on the California State Supreme Court, and of course, Senator Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey. Before that, the mayor of Newark, and even before that, a member of the Stanford football team from back in the day. And I bet some of you did not know that last fact. So let's, and we are missing one panelist, Monica Ramirez Almadani, who's a former student of mine and a great lawyer. She's recently become the head of public counsel, the largest public interest law firm in the nation. So she is here in spirit. Family commitments keep her from being here in person. But we will reconvene with her on another occasion. So let's launch into it. So for many years now, we've had a public debate about the role and the function of law enforcement in our nation. And that's figured centrally in discussions of racial justice. Most recently, we've had calls to either defund the police, to spend more money on the police, or to reform the police. So my first question for the panel is, what's the path forward with policing? And what part of government should we look to as a mechanism of change? Cory, let's start with you. What's the role, if any, for the federal government in addressing the pathologies, if we can say so, of policing?
Well, I'm assuming my mic is working? Yes, okay. So first of all, it is incredible to be back on campus, and I want to thank Stanford for this. I want to thank just the willingness to deal with these issues in this forum, and everybody for being here. So I just want to jump in because obviously I've spent, well maybe not obviously everybody, but I've spent the last year or so trying to negotiate a comprehensive policing reform bill at the federal level to try to transform American policing. Many jurisdictions around the nation, from Colorado to Kentucky, have been passing state laws to try to reform policing, and many towns and cities have been trying to transform policing as well. But the federal government, as we saw with civil rights, has a very powerful arm in the ability to transform policing in a much more comprehensive way. And the reason why we are the #1 incarceration nation on the planet Earth, 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women in the world is here in the United States of America. One of the reasons why that is because the federal government gave extraordinary incentives to states to change their laws, to fund the prison construction, and to create what we have right now is a fear-based retribution over incarceration that is particularly biased against vulnerable people, from the mentally ill to the low income, and in particular, black and brown people. When you ask me a question that starts at policing, the problem with that question is it feeds into the poverty of imagination about what the definition of safety is in America. We have created a violent society, we have created a dangerous society because we are failing to prevent problems from happening in the first place by empowering the well-being of people. And so we are a nation that does not want to deal with mental illness. We deal with it through the biggest mental illness institutions in the United States of America, which is prisons and jails. We are a nation that does not want to deal with addiction. We deal with that. The biggest facility for addicted Americans is prisons and jails. We are a nation that doesn't want to deal with the violence of poverty. Child poverty is a moral obscenity, and it also dramatically increases a child's chances of being in love and involved with court system. And I can go on. And so we've created a society where we think we're going to fix this problem by relying on men and women with guns and handcuffs and a level of training, frankly, which is stunning compared to some of the other countries, but a level of training giving people the power to kill that is shockingly short in its duration. And so I have very strong feelings about policing, but I'll end before I pass on to my colleague and classmate, my friend and classmate. When I first became the mayor of the city of Newark, my pollster had said they'd never seen anything. We were a one-issue city. Newark is a majority black city. It is if you add Latinos in it, 85% black and Latino. And the number one issue that voters were concerned about was the safety of their communities. And what some people might reflexively think is, oh, they just want more police, but the understanding in my community of what real safety is not a police officer on every corner. It goes a lot deeper than that. Again, these are issues that are all interwoven. Why in my city did you have epidemic lead contamination and poisoning amongst our children, which goes directly to brain functioning, impulse control, and more? But I sat down with the head of the FBI for the state of New Jersey, a white man, hardened in his law enforcement experience, and after him giving me a full briefing with his whole team about the gang activity in my city, I leaned back and I asked him this question very purposefully, which was, I said to him, well, how do we stop this kind of violence? And he looks at me, and in a moment of raw honesty, he says to me, you don't understand, Mayor. We don't stop this kind of violence. And we went on to have this incredible conversation where he knew, in his decades of law enforcement experience, that he was doing nothing to address the issues at hand. That this was our moral failing in this nation, that we would rather create a society where we lock each other up than be a society that creates a deeper sense of peace and, frankly, a deeper degree of empathy, compassion, and love for one another. We should not, as a society, have to spend what we think is necessary. Where the biggest budgets in any city is law enforcement. And the truth is, I can show you data after data from conservative think tanks to liberal think tanks, that dollars invested in programs that reflect our values, programs of empathy and compassion, that look at people holistically, that deal with poverty or deal with the post-traumatic stress, because veterans are over-represented, for example, in our criminal justice system. That every dollar invested in programs like that saves us as tax dollars multiples in terms of what we're spending on police and prisons. We have a morally broken system here. And the policing itself, we need to, and I hope this conversation will evolve into talking about implicit bias and the challenges you have when you give people that kind of power in a society, but don't take seriously the accounting for bias, to the point that we as a nation, most people in this room don't even know the data on police stops in their town, because we don't collect it. We don't know, we sit here right now, we don't even know how many people have been killed by the police in America, because we don't collect it. And if you are really concerned about race, the starting point with police has got to be, you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But I definitely want to start with that idea that we need to create a nation that begins to love one another through our policies, as opposed to fearing one another and locking each other up, especially the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our society.
Let me go to Maureen, because I want to hear your response from that, given your vantage point in the California government.
Sure. I think that from the perspective of state level work, we have a lot of exciting initiatives going on in California, and I think there's a really interesting intersection. So at the Department of Social Services, we've been tasked with administering 2 brand new state-funded programs that are addressing alternatives to law enforcement and crisis response. It's a community-based grant program that we're working with counties and working with nonprofit agencies to fund alternatives to law enforcement intervention. But I think what's really interesting is that in our engagement around another program, which is part of the state's historic investment in Asian and Pacific Islander equity issues, we have part of the API equity budget is a program to provide funding to community-based organizations to engage in prevention of hate incidents and to engage in community-based responses to hate incidents. And we just held a series of listening sessions where again and again, what community members and what community-based organizations were saying is we need to reconceptualize community safety. We need to have alternative understandings of what it means to create safe communities for everyone. And we need to work across racial lines, and we need to look for alternatives to law enforcement interventions in these situations. Talking about restorative justice, lifting up alternative kinds of ways of working together, mental health institutions, nonprofit organizations, community groups, alternative approaches to mental health that are potentially non-Western or non-traditional approaches, because there's simply a lack of providers in these contexts. So coming from the perspective of social services, what you're saying, Cory, resonates really powerfully with me, because I see the way that our social safety net is full of holes. and how are we going to create the conditions for safety and the conditions for collaboration and the conditions for communities to really thrive when we are under-investing in these programs at the expense or over-investing in kind of more violent or punitive systems?
And Goodwin, is there a role for the judiciary in this process of transformation?
Well, thank you, Rick. Let me begin by saying what a joy it is to be here on this panel with my fellow panelists, including my classmate, Cory. It's a joy to be on campus. As I was walking here, the men's swim team ran by in only Speedos and sneakers. So I'm having a little difficulty dislodging that image and pivoting to this more serious topic. But nonetheless, I just want to say that you started, Rick, with George Floyd, and as tragic as that incident was, and it was a tragedy of immense proportion, not just for the individual and the people affected, but really for the national consciousness, I think, about these issues. One of the silver linings, I will just say, is the immense outpouring of outrage, to be sure, but hopefully constructive protest and the registering of shared values. And one of the most indelible images, I think, from that period was seeing how wide a swath of society came out to affirm those values. And then as I look at this audience here, all of you here, every gender, every race, every color, every age, younger alums, I won't say older, I'll say more vintage alums, it's inspiring, actually, that you would take time from your busy reunion schedule to come listen to this panel as opposed to other things you could be doing right now. So that gives me hope. Let me say that I think from our standpoint in the courts, we see these issues day in and day out, and I want to pick up where Cory sort of began. Over incarceration, well, we're on the receiving end, I think, of this, because in the courts we're busy, hearing appeals, at least in my court. I sit on a 7-member court where half the jurisdiction is criminal. We have exclusive appellate jurisdiction over all the death penalty cases in California, and there's still many, many of those, despite the moratorium by Governor Newsom. African Americans in California comprise 6% of the population, 30% of the prisoners. That's an immense disproportion when you think about it. The incarceration rate per 100,000 is 10 times for African Americans what it is for other members of the population. So this is really, really grave, I think, as an indicator of where we are on racial justice. The one thing I do every year, and this gets to the solution part, you asked what we can do. The one thing I do every year, at least pre-COVID, we'll have to see about post-COVID, but is that I take my law clerks to go visit San Quentin, the prison. It's actually where death row is in California. It's where the execution chamber used to be in California before Governor Newsom ordered it dismantled. And it's actually very easy to visit San Quentin. It's just across the bay in Marin. And it's actually, strangely, one of the most beautiful pieces of real estate that exists in the Bay Area. But it's a prison. And it's one of California's oldest prisons, and it houses, in addition to death row, medium security prison population. So when you go there, you can interact with lots of inmates, and most of the time people are out in the yard and just caring about their activities. The most powerful part of the experience is always talking to the prisoners. When you talk to people, you hear a little bit about their life stories. You hear about the offenses that they committed. You hear about the time that they have spent in prison. And the one thing that you come away with, I think, regardless of what you think about their offenses or their predicament in life, is that you come away understanding that these are human beings. And I think it is the dehumanization of a wide swath of our population that is at the root. So before we can even talk about policing or institutions or anything, I think it's really in here. It's in our hearts where we have to make the biggest change. And I think that the only way you can do that, to channel Brian Stevenson, who's an author many of you have probably read, requires proximity. He talks about proximity, and I think there's a lot to that, which is that you have to put yourself in close proximity to the challenges that you face. And the whole nature of prisons, as Cory was alluding to, is to distance ourselves from that reality. But when you draw closer, you actually find that there is a lot of humanity there, and there's a lot of things that you can actually understand about the somewhat seemingly alien experience that these individuals have faced or are facing. And I think that more than anything, I take my law clerks to do that because I want them to see and feel the end product of what it is that we do. We affirm a lot of sentences in California. So that's number one, which is understanding a little bit about dehumanization, which, by the way, Rick, I'll give a shout out to your spouse. I mean, anybody who wants to learn anything about implicit bias should read the work of Jennifer Eberhardt.
I'm sorry, Goodwin, I didn't hear you. Could you repeat that?
It's on film, don't worry, you can play back to it. And the last thing I'm going to say is, one of the things that I've been doing some work on, just again, because I'm in the legal profession, is diversity in the legal profession and thinking about who holds the positions of power. And I've done some research on this, and one of the most striking things that I found in a data set was about district attorneys or elected prosecutors in America, okay? So I found a data set that was constructed by the Women's Donor Network that looked at 2,400, all 2,400 elected prosecutor positions in America. This is all the DAs, county DAs, all the state AGs. These are the top dogs because they are the elected people, right, who are in charge. Out of 2,400 something in America, what percentage do you think are minority of any kind? Of any kind? Anybody guess? 5%. Right? 5% in a country that is going to be majority minority soon, if not already. Right? Think about that. The disparity between who is in charge, right, of our criminal justice system versus who they are serving. Just a little coda on that for humor, but also insight is, I was particularly interested in how many Asian Americans there were among these 2,400, given what we've seen, right, in the news and everything going on in the pandemic and all the anti-Asian racism stuff. So initially, in this data set, they had reported there were 12 such individuals. And I was part of a research team. We were so interested who these 12 people were in America became elected Asian American DAs. And so we got the underlying data and the names and the jurisdictions. And so we called around all of them to just find out, like, what's their story? It turns out that 8 of them were miscoded as Asian. There were a couple Lees that were not Asian Lees. There was one guy named James Wang, W-A-N-G, who looked Asian, but he was in Benson County, North Dakota, and I looked at that and I said, there's no way there's some Asian American guy, elected prosecutor in Benson County. Turns out we called him, he chuckled, he said, I'm Scandinavian, you know? Oh my God. So in the end, we were only able to confirm, this was based on 2014 data, we were only able to confirm 4 elected DAs of Asian American heritage in all of America. And I think that number has now increased to 8, right? But when you think about the pandemic, and when you think about what's in the news, when you think about Atlanta and the shootings and all these things that we've been talking about, and you think about how small the voices are, right, in trying to make these points, that gives us, I think, a sense of how much work is still left to do and how important it is, actually, to have allies and a broad consensus in society that these things really matter and keep it on the front burner.
Wow. So these are some, please. I mean, you all have wonderfully highlighted some major problems and challenges that we face, and some of these have been the subject of discussion recently. But what it leads me to think or to worry about now is how do we maintain momentum and motivation to continue to address these challenges once videos of horrific incidents and so forth, they recede into the background. Let's start. We can jump in, but George, let's start with you. How do we maintain momentum and awareness of these problems once they're not in the headlines anymore?
Oh, thanks, Rick, for teeing that up. I feel like that's a little bit of a softball because the answer is to create permanent institutions and structures that will persist.
Such as?
The energy.
Such as the Stanford Center for Racial Justice.
But let me just pick up on the conversation we've just been having. I think what it illustrates to me is how complex the challenges are. Policing itself is a complex system, and it intersects with these complex societal issues and problems. And then there's the overlay and Venn diagram of public safety itself, which we're just starting to think about. And where that takes us is sort of one of the ways the center is trying to position itself is there's no simple solution. You started with the question of should we do this slogan for policing or should we do that slogan for policing? And you can't, there's no answer that a slogan is going to solve. And so what we hope to do with the center is to use our position at Stanford, the relationships and resources and research that Stanford has access to convene people, to discuss ideas, to share information broadly with people who care about the issues. We like to refer to it as democratization of knowledge, to get objective, useful, accessible information out into the world. So we think by creating a structure that can last over time and by becoming a trusted resource for objective, reliable information and the occasional major initiative, we can gain some momentum and hopefully maintain it.
Okay, thank you. Goodwin, I was reading behind your mask. Did you have a response to that?
Well, I think, so that is kind of the $64,000 question. I mean, we saw so much attention focused on these issues in the last year and a half, and of course the end question is always, is it going to last? Is this just another, spasm, right, a national spasm in the wake of an event? Let me make it personal even. This is my 30th reunion year, Cory's as well, and I'm caused to reflect.
It's my 10th.
Well, I should get rid of my gray hair.
Just shave it off.
Oh, boy. But I'm caused to reflect on the fact that, 30 years ago, just 3 months before graduation, there was another incident we all remember, which is the Rodney King beating in LA. Some of my law students now are too young to even know what the Rodney King beating is. But that is just an indication that every generation is still experiencing this kind of, frankly, it's a form of trauma to our values, to our, to all the things we hold dear. And so, how do we kind of elevate and make more prominent, right, this set of concerns so that we're not kind of cycling? I think, a couple things are interesting to observe. I have a 14-year-old daughter who's in high school. I think the younger generation coming up behind us just has light years more awareness of this stuff than we do. And in fact, it's sort of like the way there's generational change around, LGBTQ issues, that you can poll, doesn't matter if it's Democrat, Republican, whatever political persuasion, that issue travels with age, right? Younger people just have far fewer, they have just very different intuitions about it, and they're far more accepting, in other words. And I think perhaps something like that can happen or is happening on the racial justice front, where I think in our schools and in our communities, people are just talking about this a lot more. And I remember when I was in grade school, there was no discussion about this, and in fact, there was an avoidance of this. There wasn't a vocabulary, really, to talk about this. And so consequently, we grew up in a society which was largely clueless. I mean, I think I credit my Stanford education with illuminating many of these things for me, right? So I think education and generational change, that is one important lever in the discussion. But the second I'll just mention, and then I'll end, is what I began with, which is making it personal. I think every one of us can do that in our it doesn't matter what jobs you have or what titles or anything like that. Making it personal is, if you think about how same-sex marriage rights happened in America, it is because that issue traveled through the personal. It traveled through the fact that most everyone, I bet everyone in this room, knows someone who is affected by that issue, right? One way or another. And I think this is the same, that we have to step out of our comfort zones, we have to step out of our spaces. I could tell you today, go visit a prison. You can actually do that. It's not something you would think to do, perhaps, but you can do that. And if you do that, I guarantee you it's not an experience you will ever forget. It's not that you will come to some political epiphany one way or the other. It's more that you will see another dimension of the world that you did not see before. And it doesn't have to be a prison. It could be any number of experiences that take you outside of yourself. And I think that's really where the change begins and where it endures.
Wonderful, thank you. One thing, so you made the reference to Rodney King. I was actually in my first year of law school when that occurred, and this is vivid in my mind as well as a law student at the time. But one of the things that's different this time around, though, is that we've had an extraordinary outpouring of statements and statements of commitment by the private sector. In particular, the largest corporations in the United States have all made pledges of one sort or another to further the cause of racial justice. So, Cory, let's start with you on this one. What should we expect reasonably from the private sector? How do we ensure that expressions of corporate commitment don't become mere public relations efforts that lack any real substance?
I mean, it's such a big area of activity, and I've seen many businesses and corporations take real responsible efforts post the greatest and largest civil rights outpouring ever, which was after Rodney King. All 50 states, about 18 different countries protests, and there's been a lot of good change. The challenge for me is, frankly, it's just not enough, and all of us, as Goodwin says, and by the way, I just want to say for the record, just in case there's a coding mistake, I am not Asian American. I am black. But since 10 years ago when I was a Stanford student, since that time, I've been in conversations about race. And it's really wonderful to talk about the world out there and what they should do. But if we don't change, nothing will. I'm running in the Senate through the gauntlet, which is this, there's subways under the Senate, and I jump out of the car, and right now other senators are getting the gaggles around them, like my friend Joe Manchin and others. So I'm walking nicely. The row of reporters is being cleared for me by these other good senators, but I get a person that comes up to me and says, in the National Defense Bill, which is a whole different panel, but they're trying to slip the Safe Banking Act. What is the Safe Banking Act? Well, that is to allow the banking regulations to be relieved on marijuana on the marijuana industry. Now, Wall Street, which is investing in marijuana, big money, it's huge money, and I know California has equity issues, which are really wonderful, and the world is not California. And I stopped in my tracks and got very dramatic. The majority of people we lock up and incarcerate are not violent criminals, and I have a problem with the violence even term. If Goodwin and I are driving along and Goodwin jumps out and sticks somebody up and then jumps in the car with me and says, drive, I'm his friend, I drive, we get arrested, I am a violent felon. So that problem is problematic in that. Also, terming people violent almost says that they're beyond redemption in our society. We don't love them anymore because you're violent. Oh, you're nonviolent? I love you more. But 95% of the people we lock up did not commit a quote-unquote violent crime. 95%. The last year I have data for, 2019, there were more marijuana possession arrests than all violent crimes combined. And what angers me, coming from Stanford, and I got in trouble, the university got upset with me because it's the only university I really have experience with, so I always talk about drug use at Stanford. And, I get a call from the, can the senator please stop talking about drug use at Stanford? But I'm sorry, I saw a lot of very privileged people like me using pot here without concern for their lives destroyed. But now I live in the Central Ward of Newark. I'm the only United States senator that lives in a low-income black and brown community. And for what kids do here, and all of us, or knowing this audience, I would say 75% of us have done, there are lives being economically destroyed for it. No difference between blacks and whites for using marijuana, or even selling. Young white men have higher rates of selling marijuana, but blacks are 4 times more likely to be arrested for it. So I say all this to say, when somebody wants to ease the banking regulations and not do what Maureen said, which is the bill I put in when I first got into the Senate. I was laughed at, no joke, people in my own party. Now, thank God, a major restorative justice bill has the majority leader on it. It has the chairman of the Finance Committee on it. And I was overly dramatic. My chief of staff's here, and they hate when I do this, but we were in the press conference announcing our restorative justice bill, and I said, I will throw myself in the gears of government if they try to pass the banking bill without the stuff like expunging people's records, like reinvesting tax dollars in communities of color. So if you want to know what you can do, we are all participating in circles that sustain the outrageous injustice we want to condemn but not take any responsibility for. I'm sitting here at Stanford where we don't even invest our endowment with emerging managers, black and white. When he says diversity matters, well, first of all, emerging managers get better returns. But when I go into the Senate as the fourth, think about this, the fourth black person ever to be popularly elected to the United States Senate, when I walk in and look at the Judiciary Committee, and there's not even a person of color. I bumped into an Asian American that used to work there, and he said he was the only person of color to even work in that institution. These larger issues in our society, if we can't even call out our own institutions, our own organizations that we work for, and you have more power than you know. And the example I'll give you is I went to Chuck Schumer with a great senator from Hawaii. If you're from Hawaii, you got two great senators, with a guy named Brian Schatz. And we just said to him, to Chuck, and Chuck did this with alacrity, but we said to him, you need to force every Democratic senator to publish the diversity statistics on their staff. And Chuck would later tell me that that he got pushback because people were embarrassed. That here is a party, my party, that depends upon the base. And so what's happened every year now that since we've published it, the number of diverse hires, black, Latino, Asian, women, it's been going up and up and up. And guess what Chuck Schumer, who's a really candid guy, said? And this may help you with the transition, what he said, I signed on to your reparations bill, Cory, because of the black people on my staff sat down and had conversations with me. We are a better nation when we bring diverse people together. When hidden figures or with NASA astronauts, they can go to the moon.
For people here, how can people become less complicit in our not becoming the society we need to be? Cory, you just spoke of you've given people some examples of what should happen. Goodwin, you talked about the importance of being proximate to problems and appreciating the humanity of others. Maureen, and then George, what's your message to this group of Stanford alums about how they can become less complicit in our not being the nation we need to be?
I think I would say, in particular to the white folks among us, myself included, it's a question of really speaking your conscience, remembering the rooms that you're walking into and the diversity, hopefully the diversity of perspectives and experiences of the people in the rooms you're walking into, and using the power that we have as white folks in those rooms, coming from the level of privilege, whether we sort of inhabit it, experience it as privilege or not, whether we're comfortable using those terms, sort of looking at the objective context of the barriers that we haven't had to face, and really taking that question of proximity to heart and saying, who is the person that is sitting across from me? Who is the person that's sitting next to me? Who is the person that couldn't even get into this room to be part of this conversation? And what is my moral obligation? What does my conscience tell me I need to do? What can I do, whether it's raising a hand in a meeting when, a Black colleague has been interrupted and, trying to redirect the conversation to their contributions, whether it is, at the corporate board level, really examining what the implications of this vote are going to be for, not just the shareholders, but the other people who are impacted by these decisions. Really getting back in touch with our guts and our humanity, because I think that is something that, in particular, we as graduates of a university like Stanford, walking in institutions, shaping institutions that have so much power and that ask so much of us in terms of skill and intellect and showing up every day, working hard. We forget who we need to be as human beings and who our parents raised us to be, who our grandparents raised us to be, what we learned or should have learned in kindergarten, right, about how you treat other people. And we have the intellectual capability of taking that to a systems level. Like, we all can do that, and we all have the obligation to do that. So it's less, I think, about, what can I do? Should I sign a petition? Should I, post something on Facebook? And more sort of taking a step back and pausing in these day-to-day decisions that we have the privilege to make and saying, what is it? What's the next right thing to do here?
Wow, thank you.
That was very eloquent. I'm going to be short and maybe provocative. From my point of view, our democracy is under challenge and at risk. The rule of law is at risk. The future of the way our society works is at risk. And personally, I want to use all of my skills and abilities and everybody I know and Stanford and all of Stanford's alum to try to change that course. And I would encourage all of you that are in a position to do something, anything, to get on board and use your skills, use your leverage, use your influence, and help make a difference.
Thank you, okay. We are, I think I'm not alone in wishing that we could, and knowing that we could continue this conversation for hours more. But we do need to end because we are over time. And let me just close by saying that really the function of the Racial Justice Center is to try to translate these conversations to research, to policy, with the ultimate goal of creating actual change in people's lives throughout the nation. But as the Senator's comments remind us, we cannot undertake that task alone. This is a collective challenge that we confront in our society. And the only way we can meet it is through collective, concerted action, everybody working together, everybody doing their part. So let this be an invitation, as this panel has been, to invite all of you to do your part with Stanford or otherwise to help to make us the society we need to be. So thank you for joining, and we will continue the conversation.